Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, gathering over 200 participants from all over the world. Today, we are going to explore the world of tower companies. And before we get started, let's go through some practical information. So here you have a screenshot of the platform we are using today. So the webinar is recorded. You will have access to the recording tomorrow. And you can also find the presentation and some documentation in the handout tab. And please feel free to ask us any question you might have using the question tab, so with the small question mark icon. We will try to answer all questions, but depending on the time we have left, we might not be able to, but we will make sure to reply by email if we don't have time to answer your question. Finally, after the webinar, you will have access to a very short survey to give us feedback. We will be super grateful if you give us, if you leave us some feedback, and also you will be doing a good action because we will plant a tree for each feedback we receive. So that's for the practical information. And now I'm happy to introduce three of my colleagues who will be presenting today. So first we have Javier Morales from Peru. Javier is a senior regulatory analyst following digital economy and media regulations, as well as global tech trends across India, Singapore, and other Asian jurisdictions. Javier previously worked for Telefonica and for the Peruvian telecoms regulator OCIPTEL. We also have with us Miklos Kozma, who is in our Brussels office with me today. Miklos tracks and analyzes competition law developments at both EU and national level in telecoms, media, digital economy, and postal sectors. And finally, last but not least, we have Alessandro Moro joining us from Rome. Alessandro is responsible for managing our European telecoms benchmark tables and for monitoring the evolution of the telecoms regulatory framework in Italy. Before joining us, Alessandro worked at Telecom Italia and FiberCop. So thanks a lot to the three of you for being with us today. And with no further ado, I will now pass the floor to my colleague Javier. Javier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. The next slide, please. Okay. Then the next slide. Okay. Okay. No, before. Okay. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. This webinar on tower companies is an update of our previous webinar on the same topic we presented at the end of 2022. In these two last years, the volume of merger and acquisitions in this sector has slowed down, mainly in mature markets such as in Europe. These tower companies that operate in these mature markets are now more focused on growing organically through more collocations, building new sites, rather than through acquisitions. They are also trying to transform themselves into digital businesses, and they are trying to go beyond offering macro sites to also explore new ways of offering new assets and services. In this time, also these tower companies are facing new challenges, such as, for example, the consolidation of the mobile sector, also the increase of RAN sharing agreements, technological developments such as small cells and satellite technology that could reduce the dependence, the reliance in these macro sites. And this webinar will provide some highlights or some insights from our latest benchmarks on tower companies in our different services in telecoms and competition law in Europe, and also global trends across different regions. The presentation is structured in two main blocks. The first one will address an overview of the global market by exploring how these tower companies and towers are distributed among the different regions and what regulatory challenges these tower companies are facing. And in the second block, we will go deeper in how this market and ownership models in Europe, certain regulation, and also how competition authorities are analyzing merger and acquisitions in Europe. And finally, we will give a big picture about how in other regions the structure of the market is operating. So we'll start with this first block, the overview. As you can see in the next slide, we will start by analyzing the tower companies by their size. We see that there are around 30, 50, 100 tower companies globally that operate around 4 million towers. As you can see, only one of these companies, China Tower Corporation, operate 52% of those towers, while the small most quantity of these tower companies, around 300 of these tower companies, represent only 6% of these 4 million towers. The top 24 tower companies own 87% of these towers. These top 24 companies differ in their strategic how geographically they operate. For example, we see that China Tower Corporation operate only in China. Altius and Indus Towers operate only in India, while other of these companies, for example, Cellnex, operate in different countries, but only in one region, Europe, while other tower companies like American Tower operate in different countries around the world. In this particular case, American Tower operates in 22 countries in all the regions. Next slide, we will analyze how these tower companies are penetrating these towers. There are in the world there are around 5.5 macro towers. 4 million towers are owned by these tower companies. The rest, 1.5 million towers, are owned mainly by mobile operators. So we could say that tower companies have a penetration of 70% globally, but that level of penetration is different per country and per region, as you can see in the slide. United States and China has almost 100% penetration, so all towers belong to these tower companies, but the ownership models are different. For example, in the United States, we could see more than 100 tower companies, but all of them are independent. While in China, we could see that the main tower company, who is China Tower Corporation, is owned by the three main mobile operators in China. When we see this penetration by region, we could see that the Americas, Asia Pacific, and Europe have the higher level of penetration, over 70%, while Africa has 50%, and the MENA region is the lowest level of penetration with around 15%. So we could say that in Americas, Asia Pacific, and Europe are mature markets where tower companies are focused on growing organically, while in Africa and in the MENA region, tower companies could continue growing through carve-outs of mobile operators. In the next slide, we will analyze how these tower companies operate internationally. We can see that 300 tower companies, it means 85% of all tower companies globally operate in only one country. But as we saw before, those companies could be big companies like China Tower Corporation or Indus Towers, but most of them are small tower companies who operate not at national level, but probably only in certain cities and certain localities. And this is important when considering competition issues. Some regulators consider that when analyzing competition, the relevant market could be the local area. That is the case of the regulator in Colombia. But as we will see later, European authorities consider that the relevant market is at a national level. We see also that when we see the international operators, international tower companies, we see that there are around 50 tower companies who operate internationally. We see, for example, in Europe, Cellnex Vantage Towers, in Americas, American Tower, SBA Communications. Mainly the main tower companies in the United States are also the main the main tower companies in Latin America. In Asia Pacific, we see EDOTCO operating in nine countries around Asia. It's important to the difference between international companies and local companies also for the strategic point of view. International companies could enter and exit different markets. For example, recently SBA Communication, based in the United States, decided entering 5 countries in Central America because it considered that those countries offer good opportunities to grow. But at the same time, the same company, SBA, decided to exit the Colombian market because according to SBA, the Colombian market is very competitive and it found difficult to escalate in that market. So that is a possibility that these international companies could do. That is not possible for local tower companies. They don't have the resources to go to other countries. So if they want to grow, they must merge with bigger players. So contributing to the consolidation of this tower market. As we can see in the next slide, we will analyze this market also by the number of tower companies that operate in each country and each different region. We see in the slide that most of countries in Americas, Asia, Pacific, it's normal to find countries where more than 5 tower companies operate. While we see that in the MENA region, in Africa, and in the Balkans, more countries only have 1 tower company operating there. Now, it's important to realize that not more higher number of tower companies operating in one country doesn't necessarily mean more competition. For example, in Argentina, we see that there are more than 5 tower companies, but only one of them, sites, control more than 80% of those towers. But now here the question is, what is the relevant market to analyze? No? If the locality or the national, on the national level. So the next slide also show that what I said at the beginning, this how merger and acquisitions in this sector have slowed down in mature markets, mainly in mature markets as in Europe. But we see at the same time that in other markets, those transactions continue happening. That is the case, for example, in Africa and MENA, or even in Americas. As I said before, there are countries where telecoms operator could continue selling their towers directly as Millicom in Central America, or indirectly through their tower companies that they own. No? For example, in Pakistan, the operator Yas uh, so his business TowerCo to Ergo and Connect, while the the operator Telcom in Africa sold Swissnet its TowerCo to Actis. Those are infrastructure fund investments. Another interesting transaction that happened recently was Digital Bridge acquiring G Tower, that is the only or was the only tower company operating in Japan. It shows that these investment funds are found interesting in entering this Japanese market. So the conclusion here is that where there are mature markets where these merger and acquisitions are not happening for now, there are other markets where tower telecom operators could continue offering their towers to investment funds or another TowerCos. In the next slide, we go to the expectation in the future that these tower companies have for the future, no? How these towers will evolve. In Europe, uh, uh, most tower companies expect to continue growing in the macro site sector, no? Offering their sites through more co-locations and building new sites. But also, as I said before, they are considering offering new assets and even active services. For example, already now we see American Tower in the United States. It is offering also data centers, and in American Tower, also in Brazil, is offering fiber, uh, also small cells, and IoT services. Vantage Towers in Europe is offering active services, but not all tower companies follow this direction. For example, Crown Castle in the United States recently decided to sell its fiber and small cell businesses to focus entirely in macro towers, because this it, they many tower companies consider that exploring other assets requires a great level of specialization, and other companies who work already in those sectors have advantage on those sectors. When we go to other countries, for example, the regulator in Colombia also asked the same question to tower companies in Colombia. What is the expectation for the future? And they said that in the long term, they expect that macro towers will be replaced by poles. They are also expecting the emergence of neutral networks, and also the convergence among terrestrial and satellite technologies. It means that they expect that in the short and medium term, they will continue offering their macro size, but in the long term, they need to evolve by offering other kinds of services. As most experts in the sector agree, is that the future of tower companies will depend on finding the right balance between offering the current operations, the current macro sites in the short and medium term, and exploring new opportunities for the long term. So the next slide, the last slide for this overview, will comment something about the regulatory challenges of these tower companies. We see that in all countries, the most common challenge is the different rules across local governments. That happens in all countries around the world. They say that, for example, in Malaysia, tower companies are only granted the possibility to deploy sites in certain localities, but not at national level. But even if there are uniform framework of rules at national level, as is the case of Peru, for example, that when we have a national antenna law, several local governments don't follow those rules uh, for policy reasons or etc. So as the Colombian regulator have sustained, has agreed that even efficient regulation is not enough to promote this kind of site deployment, but it's necessary also coordination among national authorities with local governments, but also coordination among authorities, operators, tower companies, and even the communities. As we can see, also community resistance to deploy towers is one of the bigger problems. Uh, Another problem is the lack of electricity, mainly in countries in Africa and in the MENA region, but even in rural areas in different countries, in different regions, that is also a problem that could be addressed through subsidies by governments for deploy sites in these rural areas. That is happening, for example, in Japan, Australia, or even in Peru. Duplication of towers is another common problem, no? That is happening in Thailand and Vietnam, where you can see that there are three towers close one of the other, a few meters, with each one with different tenants. Uh, so that is not efficient. In Cambodia, for example, have published a rule to avoid this kind of situation. Also, when we go to license and ownership, that is to allow entrance of these tower companies, there are certain companies, mainly in the MENA region or even in Asia, happened in the past, or in Africa, is like there are a lack of regulatory framework for these companies, for these tower companies to enter. There are countries where there are not tower companies operating there, but there are certain tower companies who are interested in entering in the market, but they cannot do that because there are not this regulatory framework who allow them to enter. So several countries are discussing to create a license for the operators, for these tower companies to enter the market. And also certain countries like Algeria, for example, impose international restriction. No? For example, in Algeria, tower companies could operate there only if they have 51% domestic ownership. So that is a restriction for international companies to enter that market. And if we go to this new kind of offering, this new kind of asset that we said before, also there are certain restrictions in certain countries that where, for example, if these tower companies want to offer fiber, they cannot because the license only allows them to provide towers. So, for example, in Rwanda, tower companies are discussing with regulators to allow them to offer fiber. So regulators are issuing licenses to operate. The same thing happened in Oman when tower companies could also offer in-building solutions, but they cannot do that right now. It's like, so they are getting licenses to operate. So in conclusion, we see that there are regulatory challenges in the traditional macro site model, but also regulatory challenges in these new kind of services. So with this, this is the first block. And in the next block, Alessandro will continue talking about how Europe is operating these kind of companies. Alessandro.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Javier. So I will show you the results of a benchmark Cullen realized to provide an overview of the different business models adopted by mobile operators in 23 different European countries. In the benchmark, we also analyzed whether tower companies must be registered under the general authorization regime, and if governments adopted specific legislation to stop foreign takeovers of towers. So let's start with the first issue, which is the business models chosen by mobile operators. So apart from the case where operators decide to keep towers within the company's perimeter, they could decide to move towers into a fully owned, legally separate company while keeping the complete ownership, 100%. Or they could decide to partially or completely sell the towers. So they could decide to sell a certain percentage of the ownership while taking a stake, or completely sell the towers to external players. And these two cases could be further divided into several sub-cases. For example, the MNO could decide to keep control with a stake above 50%, or the new tower company could be totally in charge, or there could be a joint venture between different mobile operators, or there could be the case whether the parent company is holding, owning both the mobile operator and the tower company, etc. In the next slide, we will see the results of this analysis. We analyzed 26 different companies and operations in these European countries, and we found out that in 24 cases, the 100% of the ownership was passed to other players, which could be not only tower companies, but also investment funds like KKR, or also companies providing a wide range of services, like, for example, Tawal, a Saudi Arabia company. In other 24 cases, the mobile operator decided to partially sell the ownership of the towers. As I said, there could be a case where it kept control or not. There could be joint venture, like the case of Inuit in Italy, a joint venture between TIM and Vodafone Italy, which is now over when TIM decided to sell all its stake. In 8 cases, the towers are moved into a legally separate company, completely owned by the mobile operator. Now, we have no time now to describe all these cases, but in the next slide, we just provide an overview of these 8 cases. So we have two examples in Norvegia and one each in Czech Republic, Finland, France, Slovakia, Spain, and Sweden. What is important to highlight is that these are the current cases still in force, but in several other situations, towers were first moved into legally separate company, but this was only the first step of a longer process which brought to eventually sell the towers. Why do operators do that? Mainly because in this way, putting towers in a separate company, they show to the market the intrinsic asset value of towers. There could be also legal issues sometimes. So all the other examples are not listed here because they are passed into the other cases I showed before. Just to give you in the next slide an example of the main players currently active in Europe. Cellnex is a Spanish infrastructure company operating in several countries. We found out that in 12 these different countries, it actually bought towers from mobile operators. And eventually, in a couple of situations like Austria or Ireland, it later sold these towers. Vantage, another very important player. Vantage Towers were originally founded by Vodafone Group. Actually, Vodafone still has a stake in Vantage through the Oak Fund. Vantage Tower operates in 10 of the analyzed countries. Now, this is just an overview to give you a big picture, but not all the countries with the presence of Cellnex and Vantage are covered here. And let's pass to the second question we analyzed. Next slide. Whether tower companies are registered under a general authorization regime, just like a normal telecommunication operator. We found out that in 12 countries, tower companies are registered under the general authorization framework, which are those in the light green, while in other 10 countries, those in dark green, companies are not requested to be registered. And we finally arrived to the third question, which is actually quite important. The next slide, which is whether the governments decided to adopt a specific legislation to stop foreign takeover of towers. The results is that in no country we found any kind of legislation aimed at stopping specifically tower takeover by foreign players. But in many countries, there are several laws and rules in place to control and monitor, stop in some cases, foreign takeovers of assets which are strategic for the countries. So in several countries, you can see Austria, Czech Republic, France, etc. There are forms of screening mechanisms to control foreign investments. In Denmark, the foreign player which want to enter into the national market must first present a preliminary application to the authority in charge. In Spain and Estonia, specific authorization must be get for foreign investors to operate in the country. In Italy, the government makes large use of golden power to control, monitor, eventually stop foreign takeovers in strategic sectors. And in countries like Norway and the UK, which are, by the way, non-EU member states, there are special veto powers in force, mainly for national security reasons. So this is the conclusion of my part, and Miklos, the floor is yours now.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. So, as Alessandro said, many European telecom operators sold their towers to independent TowerCos in recent years. And some of these transactions were investigated by competition authorities in Europe under merger control rules. And we have been following these cases at Canon International's Antitrust and Merger Service. So I'd like to share some interesting aspects that we have seen. So transferring towers from a vertically integrated operator to an independent TowerCo is a form of vertical disintegration that is generally positive from a competition point of view. Given that an independent TowerCo acts as a neutral host, its sites usually have higher co-location ratios than the sites of vertically integrated operators, which means that it is easier to access infrastructure for smaller MNOs and for fixed wireless access operators, which then means lower barriers to entry in downstream telecom markets. So this is viewed positively by regulators. However, in some cases, these transactions might raise some competition concerns, specifically when there is a risk that a TowerCo could gain excessive market power in the passive infrastructure market through an acquisition. And this may result in telecom operators facing higher prices and more onerous contractual conditions. And this could have knock-on effects on the end users of telecom services. Now, it is the role of competition authorities to intervene in these cases by requiring remedies or blocking the transactions if there is no suitable remedy. And for most transactions where TowerCo acquired towers in in Europe didn't face intervention and were cleared unconditionally by competition authorities. But we have seen 3 cases of intervention by NCAs, national competition authorities, and these are shown on the next slide. So here I listed those 3 cases as well as 2 others, which I selected because these 5 cases are actually quite similar. They each involve the acquisition of the tower business of a telecom operator by Cellnex. These were all countries where Cellnex already had a significant market position before the transaction. In every case, the transaction would result in Cellnex owning roughly half of all the towers in the country. Meanwhile, most of the other half would be owned by a vertically integrated operator or a joint venture of operators. So there are a lot of similarities in these cases, which is why it's so interesting that there was a lot of divergence in how the NCAs decided the cases. The Polish and Portuguese transactions were cleared unconditionally after an initial phase 1 review. The French transaction was cleared after a phase 1 review, but it was subject to significant structural remedies, so subject to divestiture. And in Italy and the UK, the NCAs carried out in-depth phase 2 investigations, and they both eventually cleared the transaction subject to commitments, but the nature of these commitments were actually quite different. So on the next slide, we have an outline of how the relevant market was typically defined by NCAs in these cases. So all NCAs found that there was a tower market, which is a market that's upstream of the markets for mobile telecom services and other wireless communication services. And typically, this market was defined, the product market side, by the NCAs as the provision of infrastructure hosting services on macro sites to third-party wireless communication providers. Now, this means that the product market includes all types of macro sites, so ground-based towers, rooftop sites, and other macro sites, while small cells are usually not included. And the market also includes the provision of services to all kinds of telecom customers, so MNOs, fixed wireless operators, and IoT providers. But it does not include other types of customers that TowerCos may have. So the provision of services to broadcasters, for example, is not part of the same product market. And the market does not include self-supply by vertically integrated MNOs and their joint ventures. Now, on the geographic scope, most NCAs defined it as nationwide, even though the sites in one locality are not as such substitutable with sites in another locality. But NCAs found that the nationwide market was justified because the main TowerCos tend to have a broad range of sites across the country, and they conclude framework agreements with customers instead of negotiating on a side-by-side basis. But even while defining a nationwide market, all NCAs recognize the importance of geographic location of the site, and they considered local aspects in their assessments and also in the design of remedies. So this is how the market was generally defined, but there are some variations. For example, I'll mention in a moment the market segmentation that the French NCA has used in its case law. So we can go to the next slide. When it comes to the cases in Portugal and Poland, so Cellnex's acquisition of towers from NOS and from Polkomtel, the NCAs were not particularly concerned about the increasing concentration in the tower market. Instead, they focused on the pro-competitive aspects of the transactions because they said that these transactions bring about a major improvement compared to the status quo where the towers belonged to a telecom operators. So the towers were captive, and now they will belong to a neutral host. I think it's interesting to contrast this with the British NCA's analysis in the Cellnex Hutchison case, because the British NCA said that, okay, the transaction is an improvement over the status quo, but the status quo is actually not the right basis for comparison for this competitive assessment. And this is what we call the counterfactual in competition law. So in the British case, the NC found that in the absence of its deal with Sanex, Hutchison would have probably sold its towers to an alternative purchaser, perhaps another TowerCo that doesn't already have a big presence in the UK. And the NC considered this because Hutchison had a strong incentive to raise capital for investments in its MNO subsidiary, 3UK, including in the rollout of 3UK's 5G network. And the NCA found that there were credible alternative purchasers interested in acquiring the towers. So in the end, these towers would probably escape from captivity in any case, even if they are not acquired by Sanex. And this had significant implications for the NCA's assessment. So on the next slide, we have a brief summary of the UK case, of the Sanex Hutchison UK case. The NC's assessment mainly focused on the geographic overlaps between the parties' site portfolios. And to address the NC's competition concerns, Sanex committed to eliminate all overlaps through the divestiture of sites. When I say overlaps, the extent of the overlaps was based on the catchment distances that were used internally by 3UK to determine when an existing site can serve as an alternative for another existing site. On the next slide, we have a summary of the Italian case, which also involves Sanex and Hutchison, but this time Hutchison's Italian tower business. In its assessment, the Italian NC focused on the high market share that Sanex had in the Italian tower market. So if we exclude self-supply by operators, the NC found that Sanex accounted for 60 to 70% of revenues in the market. And after taking over Hutchison's tower business, the Sanex's market share would increase to over 70%, and this would amount to a dominant position according to the NCA. In this case, Sanex managed to address the NCA's competition concerns by giving a set of behavior commitments. So Sanex made commitments for 7 years that it would grant access to a certain number of Hutchison towers on reasonable and non-discriminatory terms, and that it would not exercise any early termination rights under its existing contracts for hosting services on its towers. Finally, on my last slide, we have the French case involving Sanex's acquisition of Highbury, which used to be the tower company of Altice SFR. This case was different from the previous two in the sense that the NCA carried out only a shorter phase 1 review. So the French NCA focused on overlaps in specific segments of the tower market, which was in line with the previous French case law. So the NCA distinguished between different types of macro sites, so between ground-based towers, rooftop sites, and then a third category of other macro sites, which included water towers and bridges. And also geographically, the NCA distinguished between urban areas on one hand and rural and peri-urban areas on the other hand. So in this case, the NCA was concerned that the parties had an extremely high combined market share in two market segments, rooftop sites in urban areas and other category of sites in urban areas. And the parties managed to secure clearance by divesting sites so that there will be no addition of market share in these market segments. So this involved the divestiture of a significant number of sites, but it allowed the parties to avoid a lengthy phase 2 investigation. So that was all I wanted to share, and now I will give the floor back to Javier.
Thanks, Miklos. So in the next slide, we will show quickly big pictures about how different regions, different countries inside those regions are structured. The market is structured. No? See here, for example, in the case of Americas, including the United States and some countries in Latin America, are structured. the market share. As we saw before, Americas in average has around 85% level of penetration, but this kind of penetration vary among countries. That happens in all regions, obviously. In this case, Brazil has 100 penetration, and not only that, but also we see that the competition is strong because the four big players have a kind of homogeneous market share. In general, we see that the 3-4 big players have homogeneous market share in these countries. We see also, we saw before, that there are the two top players are American Tower, based in the United States, and Telesite Sites, based in Mexico. But also most top players in this region are based in the United States. And when we go deeper we go in the broader telecom sector in the region, we see there are some companies, some telecoms operators, some mobile operators like Telefonica or Boom are exiting the market. Several countries in Latin America. There are other countries like Colombia who are consolidating the sector. We see also the different share active agreements, around sharing agreements, for example, between Telefonica and Intel. Some countries like Chile and Brazil who are testing this device to device with satellite technology, and also several rural projects that are incentivized by the government, for example, in Peru. So we see here that also there are, in the case of Colombia, we see that there are one tower company who is called Tower One Wireless, who is specialized in rural areas. So in general, we see recently, also importantly to say, some countries, some regulators have been very interested in the tower market. For example, the Mexican regulator and the Colombian regulator recently, some few months ago, published big reports about how this tower market is structured and what are competition policy concerns on these markets. And Chile recently also launched a public consultation about how to promote different new ways to promote infrastructure sharing. So we see here that in conclusion, for this region is very competitive, a lot of presence of tower companies, and regulators are following, monitoring these markets, and even like in the case of Peru, for example, testing with regulatory sandboxes to deploy sites in rural areas. So when we go to the other slide to see the structure of Asia Pacific, we see again that as we saw before, as an average, the entire region has a high level of penetration, more than 70%, but countries differ. No? We saw that here. We see here that China, Australia, and China have 100% penetration of these tower companies, while other countries like Korea or even Singapore, who is not in this slide, have 0% penetration. We see also that in the case of Asia Pacific, DOTCO is the only pan-Asian regional operator that is placed in 9 different countries, and is the leader, the main operator in several countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Malaysia. We saw before that recently several investment funds have found are interested in investing in tower companies in Japan. So we see that there is interesting movements like we saw before is like also American Tower exiting the market in India, and with that exiting, Altius and Indus Tower in India became the second and third bigger player globally. So we see in general that ASEAN markets are also well positioned in this tower company market. In the next slide, we will see the situation in Africa. Again, an average as a whole, they have a 50% level of penetration, but as you can see here, is different between countries. Now, South Africa is very developed when there are around 30 tower companies, and you see here that the four top have a strong market share. We see also other countries like Ethiopia without any tower co, or Angola that has only one tower company, and thus is a local company who is self-financing its own deployments. Angola is an interesting case because most towers are rooftop towers, and that is because as several ex-communist countries, many properties officially continue being part of the government, but in reality, so landowners don't have documents to prove the property. So there are these kind of problems with regulators. So the tower companies have decided to deploy uh, roof towers. The other interesting case to see here is that region there not as in Latin America, that are like in Latin America are like these 70 regional towers, but here that there are a good number of regional international towers. No, you see here in Africa also American Tower is leading this market in several countries. No, we see here in Uganda, in Ghana, in Kenya. But there are other big players like Helios Towers, IAIS Towers, or AMN. So there are different regional tower companies. In Africa, a big problem is getting power. So also there is an emergence of new network as a service companies, no, that provide not only passive infrastructure but also active infrastructure. There are also small players and big players offering this kind of services, even in rural areas. No? But this is also a challenge for regulators because currently regulators treat these network as a service companies in the same way as tower companies, when clearly the business model is different. And finally, in the last slide, we will see the situation with the MENA region. When as we saw before, the penetration in MENA is very low. No? Most countries don't have tower companies operating there. But a recent interesting case there is the merger that is underway between two big telecom companies and the tax towers. If that operation is concreted, they will create a regional tower company who will be placed in 6 or 7 countries in the region. In the MENA region, also a big problem is electricity. So there are a lot of tower companies who have become also offering power as a service. And you see here the difference in countries. No? In several countries, tower companies are facing the problem of lacking electricity. But in Saudi Arabia, for example, in the case of tower or tax towers also, they are offering smart pools because in Saudi Arabia, many smart city projects that is part of a vision of this country for 2030. So we see the difference also, like in Africa, South Africa with other countries are very different. In here, the difference with Saudi Arabia with other countries are very different too in the development of those markets for tower companies. Uh, Also important to say that in Africa and the MENA region, there is an expectation that the population will grow exponentially in the next decade. So there is a good expectation for these companies to operate there because the demand of data will be great in those places. So in conclusion, in the last slide that we're up, we will see that regarding market shifts, there is a movement from consolidation from macro towers in mature markets where we see before merger and acquisition have slowed down because almost in those mature markets, telecom operators have sold off their towers. But now, in the long term, this market, these tower companies are trying to diversify their portfolio, different assets and services. Also, regulatory challenges. There are barriers and opportunities. As we said before, barriers regarding license, foreign ownership, but also coordination about local authorities, and opportunities for these regulators to allow these tower companies to evolve by offering other services. So this would be the conclusion of our presentation. Thank you for your assistance. If you have questions, please, Sarah,
Yes, well, thank you for the presentation. We have some few minutes to take some questions. Maybe the first one for Miklos. Regarding tower sales in Europe, are there any cases decided by the EU Commission?
When it comes to the acquisition of sites by TowerCos, what I was talking about, most cases and certainly all the interesting cases were handled at the national level by national competition authorities, which results kind of from the thresholds that we use in Europe to allocate jurisdiction between different authorities. So none of these cases landed at the European Commission, but there was one interesting case where the Commission analyzed the tower market, which is when it assessed the creation of Inwit, the joint venture of Vodafone and Telecom Italia. And this was more of a vertical case, but it involved an analysis of the tower market and involves some remedies, so it's an interesting case. But as far as I know, that's the only case so far where the Commission looked at this market.
Yeah, okay. I see another question that is more for me. So yes, you will be able to get a copy of the presentation. Actually, you can already download it in the documentation tab, which is really next to the question tab. And we will also send it by email, I think on Monday. So that was my question. Then maybe a question for Alessandro, but I think you already replied, you already answered during your presentation. So are there in the analyzed countries different regulations on foreign takeover of towers between EU and non-EU countries?
Yes, very quickly. In general, the answer is yes. There is a difference between EU and non-EU countries, but we should bear in mind that national legislation may vary. So, for example, there is the foreign direct investment regulation, which provides a general framework, but then each country can decide to go over or below those rules, and so it really depends. And just to give an example, other rules are in place whether the foreign takeover is a subsidized subject. In this case, Commission must intervene and control. So the general answer is yes, but it depends from the national circumstances also.
Okay. And then very quickly, you have 10 seconds to reply, Javier. Could you provide examples of countries previously without TowerCos that enabled their entrance?
Uh,
Mhm.
yes, but most importantly is to say that tower companies who don't want to enter a market generally is because that the sector, the mobile sector is not competitive. So if there is only one mobile operator or two mobile operators competing among them, so this is not a business case for tower companies. So if regulators want to make the market more efficient, they will try to promote the entrance of another mobile operator. And once the mobile sector is competitive, now in that situation, our companies will be interested in entering that market. Having said that, that's the Philippines was an interesting case that where 4 or 5 years ago, the market only worked with two operators, but the authority decided to allow the entrance of a new operator and consequently promoting the market, the sharing of infrastructure with these new tower companies. And nowadays, it's a very developed market for tower companies. So and there are other cases like that, no?
Okay, well, we are now officially a bit over time. So, well, for the other questions that we have, we will do our best to reply to you by email. So, well, thank you to Miklos, Alessandro, and Javier. I think it was very interesting presentation. Just very few information before leaving. If you have any other questions, please send us an email. It's always very interesting. And please don't forget also to give us your feedback. It's super useful to us also, well, for future events, but also because, as I said at the beginning, we will plan to tree for each feedback we receive. So please help us have a new forest by the end of the week. And yeah, so on behalf of Cologne International and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.